Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Femininja Project. And thank you so much for tuning in. As always, I have a fabulous guest with me today who I also consider my friend. I just met him recently, a few weeks ago, at a book event, and we just really clicked. He's a great guy and a great storyteller. His name is Jack Maher. He is a historical novelist, proud fifth generation Colorado native and grandson of Eric Douglas, who was a pioneering Denver Art Museum curator, Native arts champion, and the focus of Jack's best selling book titled Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. Jack is also a former Nine News multimedia journalist and executive producer, a four-time Emmy winner, and the recipient of multiple broadcasting honors from the Associated Press and the Colorado Broadcasters Association. What a resume. Jack, thank you so much for being here and welcome to the show.
Cheryl, thank you very much. And I truly appreciate our friendship. You know, it's funny, you do meet people throughout the course of your life, but there are certain ones that seem to be soulmates, and I would say you're one of them.
Oh, thank you. I feel the same way about you. We just had this instant connection. And yeah, so it's such an honor to have you on the show and an absolute delight to be able to talk to you again.
Thank you.
So now I'm really curious, before we even get to the book, is how and why you got started in journalism. Because I think that would be a really tough field just to get into and a tough field to work in. And we had a few conversations about that at the book fair.
You know, it is a great question. I am told that when I was very little, back in the 1950s, I would be sitting in my high chair watching the CBS News. And I'm not sure how that all started, if my mom just plopped me up in front of the black and white TV and that's what she had on or what. But I just gravitated towards news from a very young age. And I was on the school newspaper in junior high at the time, you know, now it's known as middle school, and then high school. What was really formative was in my junior year, my journalism teacher, who is to this day one of my best friends, and she really is an incredible influence on my career. She happened to look outside. I was at George Washington High School in Denver, and she saw a Nine News crew that was putting away their equipment. They had come to the school to do a story, and she opened the window on our third floor journalism classroom and yelled down and said, "Hey, would you guys come up and talk to our class? They'd love to learn about you." And so the reporter, Ron Mitchell, and his photographer, Butch Montoya, came up, and they spent, you know, about 20 minutes talking about their day and what it was like. And that just lit something up inside
Mm.
me. Well, long story short, I ended up getting a degree in communications at New Mexico State. I worked at small stations in New Mexico and Texas, the whole time trying to get back to Channel 9 because that was the station to work for.
Mhm.
And it finally happened in 1980 when they decided to launch Denver's first full-fledged morning show. And they said to me, you know, because I was an anchor and a reporter doing a lot of on-air stuff, they said, you know, you look too young to be on our on-air staff. Have you ever thought about being a producer? And I had actually produced as well. And so I said, yeah, I'd give it a shot just to come back to Denver. And so here they tapped me to start this morning show. And eventually I became executive producer. And believe it or not, Cheryl, I became Ron Mitchell's boss, the guy who talked to me as a high schooler all those years before. And I just didn't feel worthy. He was an amazing reporter and storyteller and a great writer. And I was just over the moon to be working alongside him, let alone supervising him. It was a
Okay,
tough business.
I just have to interrupt you, and I apologize for that, but there's almost something very poetic in that story of
Yeah,
how, you ended up becoming his boss. And I guess it kind of proves the point that you never know who you're talking to, or you never know what connections you make, where they can lead you and where they could take you.
that is so very, very true. And when Ron passed, a few years ago, and I was at his memorial service. It was so heartening to see all the lives that this man had touched,
Mm.
not only through his TV news career, but also, believe it or not, as a stamp collector. He was like really well known throughout Colorado for his knowledge of philately and just the history of Colorado stamps and everything. And there was a big community of those people as well. So I
Wow.
know he touched many other lives besides mine in other fields.
Wow. So, how long were you in the field and when did you leave it and why? What was the
Sure. I was at Nine News for 34 years.
wow.
And I did just about everything you can imagine. I helped manage a newsroom of about 200 people. I line produced different shows. I launched different shows because as the 80s and 90s progressed, local operations started realizing that these could be very profitable hours of television if you expanded. And as I say, we started as a half hour in
Mm,
1980. And by the time I retired in 2014, we had grown to producing 4.5 hours of morning show content over two
wow.
different TV stations. It was a duopoly. So we had Channel 9, we had Channel 20, huge staff, just a lot of resources. But, working a morning show, people don't realize the people behind the scenes have to get there way early, like at
Mhm.
midnight or between midnight and 3 a.m. to prepare the stuff. So you guys will have a great show when you wake up and turn on the TV. And
Mhm.
I think the hours were taking their toll on me.
Mhm.
And I just realized that, I didn't want to risk physically what I could tell was starting to happen to me with these overnight hours. And
Mhm.
so, yes, I retired in 2014. I continued my multimedia career with Jeffco Public Schools and actually launched a YouTube channel for them and did stories about teachers and students and programs. And I kept that up for 7 more years. Then I finally retired in 2021 and decided to write this book.
Mhm. Okay, so tell us about the book. I mean, I love the title, Poppy. So just where the inspiration came from. By the way, I love your grandfather's story on so many levels and for so many reasons. And we'll talk about some of the things that, highlighted his life that I think are absolutely fascinating that the audience would love to hear. But so what was the precipitating, factor that, hey, I think I'm going to write this story? Did you always want to write the story about your grandfather, or did it just come out of the blue?
Growing up, I really didn't know a whole lot about him or his legacy at the Denver Art Museum. Just
Mm,
to quickly set the stage, Eric Douglas was really one of the people who helped launch what was then known as the Indian Arts Department at the Denver Art Museum. He was recruited by Ann Evans, daughter of Territorial Governor John Evans, very controversial governor, who
mm-hmm,
was connected infamously with the Sand Creek Massacre.
mm-hmm,
And it is my opinion that Anne, as a result of that tragedy, really wanted to give back,
mm,
because of the wrongs that had happened at Sand Creek. And so
mm-hmm,
she helped launch the Denver Art Museum, the Denver Public Library. She was active in a number of cultural events. And so she recruited Eric to help with this mission. At the time, a lot of people were very concerned about what was going to happen with Native Americans because of what white America had done, putting them on
mm-hmm,
reservations and whatnot. And so she and many others were concerned that their uh, way of life was going to evaporate and was to go away, especially the art. And so she asked Eric to help her in preserving this art and to highlight it in the Denver Art Museum, which was pretty radical at the time because a lot of people did not consider Native American art to be worthy of inclusion in a
mm-hmm,
museum. And so people like Anne, people like Eric changed the minds of many people by putting it in a museum setting and highlighting it in very innovative ways. I should say that Eric's love of Native American art was inherited from his father, Winfred Douglas. And my great grandfather, Winfred, was an Episcopal priest.
Mm.
and he specialized in sacred music. In fact, he was instrumental in helping write the hymnal for the Episcopal Church. And he incorporated a lot of beautiful music that was called plain song. If you've ever been in a church setting and you've heard like what sounds like monks singing,
Mhm.
unaccompanied, but just their music, that is what plain song is all about. It's ancient, and he felt it really could almost open up a window into heaven
Mm.
itself. And so he devoted his life to that. He was from the New York area, but he just worked so hard on his music that one day they found him collapsed at the foot of his organ. And his superiors sent him to Colorado to repair his broken health. This was something that was done in the late 1800s fairly frequently. A lot of people were sent to Colorado with lung ailments and other problems.
Mhm.
Well, he not only came out west for the air, but he decided that he needed to go into the great Southwest, into the Four Corners region, and just to go off by himself by horseback with just a bedroll and get out in the elements. He just had some sort of desire within him that this would help with, his compromised immune system.
Mhm.
In the course of doing that and camping out in this region, he befriended a lot of Native American tribes people and artists, and he fell in love with this art and their culture. And the Hopi, in particular, kind of adopted him. They gave him a name. They made him a blood brother, called him Tall Pine Tree, which
Mhm.
was because he was a very tall man. And this love of Native American art persisted throughout his life, which he then handed down to Eric. They had this beautiful home up in Evergreen, which we've referenced. It's today known as the Haiwan Heritage Park. But back then it was called Camp Neosho. And Camp Neosho is a beautiful multi-room log home that was handcrafted out of ponderosa pine. And the fellow who put it together was a Scotsman who is well known throughout the Colorado mountain community named Jock Spence, who came up with these innovative eco-friendly designs to make these places like the Haiwan Homestead, Camp Neosho. And he would even build certain elements of this log home, this lodge, around pine trees so he wouldn't have to cut them down.
Oh.
And if today you should go up there and visit, which I hope you do, you'll learn a lot about the Douglas family and the legacy they created. But they filled this home with this Native American art, which they purchased from artists, and then which Eric then donated to the Denver Art Museum to start this department. And he just spent his life advocating for these artists and trying to point out that not only is it a piece of art that represents heritage in the past, but there are still creators making it contemporaneously. That is
Mhm.
art that is still being made and needs to be, elevated and shown to these
Mhm.
audiences that come to the museum. I'd
Mhm.
heard about this story growing up in bits and pieces.
Mhm.
My grandmother, Frida, who figures prominently in my story about Poppy, she swept in when I was just a kid and really saved our little family because I'll tell you, to be honest, I came from a dysfunctional background. We had alcoholism, we had mental illness. There was a lot of stuff going on. And she stabilized our little family. I don't think I'd be here talking to you today, Cheryl, if it wasn't
Oh.
for her. Frida Douglas, we called her Baba. And honestly, her main task was making sure that the rent got paid, that we had food, that we had clothes for school, and the whole past life there at
Mhm.
Haiwan Homestead, her life with Eric and the Native American art, that really wasn't part of her, world anymore. And so she didn't really talk about it until one day when she brought in a supplement that the Denver Post used to publish called Empire Magazine.
Mhm.
And the cover story was about Camp Neosho, about the family home up in Evergreen, and about the Douglas family. And she gave it to me. I was just a teenager. And she said, Jack, you may want to hang on to this because it's about our family and you might find it interesting. That was really it. Well, she passed away. I, of course, was busy with my TV life, in Texas
Mhm.
and New Mexico and eventually Denver. And it wasn't until 2012 when some people from the Denver Art Museum somehow heard about me and my relationship with Eric Douglas. They contacted me at 9 and said, "Hey, you're Eric Douglas's grandson." And I said, "Yes, I am. Would you come and do a lecture at the Denver Art Museum about your grandfather? Because we have a group here called the Douglas Society. They were formed to honor your grandfather." I didn't know this. And I was terrified, Cheryl, because, I just had not spent a lot of time researching him. I knew these little bits and pieces. I'd been up to the Haiwan Homestead, Camp Neosho a time or two, but really I was not an expert. And so when I went before this group, my heart was beating out of my chest. I'd done some quick research, cliff notes on Eric Douglas, and I cobbled together a 90-minute lecture, which I kind of stumbled through. And I think I did okay, but I realized, man, this guy needs a lot more than a 90-minute lecture. So in the back of my mind, I had it to write this book, to make sure that his contributions to the Denver Art Museum, his relationships with these different tribes people and their art would not be forgotten, primarily by my family, but hopefully by a wider audience.
So let me
But
ask you again, this occurred in 2012, is that right? Or
that's when I was lecturing, yes.
Wow, okay. Well, that's pretty remarkable that you were able to pull that out and do a 90-minute, talk about it.
It's something about TV news. We are sometimes given impossible tasks, and we, after pulling off some pretty massive coverage opportunities, like the opening of Denver International Airport, the visit of Pope John Paul II, sadly, the Columbine shooting. I mean, there were just so many big stories. Somehow the adrenaline kicks up and you just find a way to do it. And I drew on those abilities to do this lecture. But really what propelled the book more than anything was the sudden death of my beautiful Becky. She was my wife. We were together for almost 49 years.
Wow.
And she suffered a brain aneurysm at church. And I don't know if you want me to go into that. It's a beautiful story, but
yeah,
but
I
her
would be honored if you want to share that with the listeners, because it is a beautiful story and you told it to me, when we first met, and I just want to make sure that the listeners have the opportunity to hear it too and to be able to honor Becky.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that very much. Well, Becky was a corporate travel agent. We met at a Catholic school dance in 1970. And I'm going to give you a couple of dates here because it's important to the story, but it was November 21st, 1970. I saw her from across the gym. There was a cover band that I was there helping with lighting for. It was called Phaedra. And they had gotten a pretty good reputation around Denver for playing, school dances. And they were playing Neil Young's Cinnamon Girl. And they're across.
Jack, I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Your sound just all of a sudden went out.
Let's try it again. How about now?
Yes, I can hear you. So, okay, it cut off right at they're across the room and they were playing the Cinnamon Girl, and then all of a sudden the sound went dead.
So I see this beautiful girl, her hair was the color of a shiny copper penny. And I got the courage to ask her to dance. Thankfully, she said yes. And we just had a beautiful relationship. She was my best friend. 3 children, 2 grandchildren. Well, in 2019, she was a corporate travel agent, really good at what she did, but a lot of stress. And on top of that, our oldest son at the time was a Navy pilot. He was flying Super Hornets, F-18s, off of carriers. And he was in really dangerous places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And we didn't know where he was a lot of the time. So, being a mom, she really worried about him. Well, she had heard that Eucharistic adoration was a great way to deal with anxiety. And for those who are not Catholic, in the Catholic faith, we believe that the bread that is the centerpiece of the Mass on Sundays is the true body of Christ. And Eucharistic adoration is a time for you to be in a little chapel with that body of Christ, which is in a beautiful gold sculpture called a monstrance. And so you sit in this chapel and you just spend time with Jesus, praying and reflecting. Well, on this particular night, you spent about an hour in Eucharistic adoration, and she found it really did help with her anxiety. She was in our chapel at Ave Maria Church, and there was one other fella in the chapel. It was just Becky and this other fella. And he was sobbing. He was just really disconsolate. He was dealing with something. And after the hour of adoration was up, they both left to go to their cars in the parking lot. And Becky approached him, which was kind of unusual because she was pretty shy by nature. But she couldn't help. There was something about this man that tugged at her heart. And she went up to him and she said, "Hey, you look like you're new here at the church. I just want to let you know Ave Maria is a great place. We've got a lot of great people here. I'm in a ministry that we call the Guardians. And the Guardians are people that stand at the front of the church at Mass during the Eucharist to make sure people are treating the Eucharist with respect." And she said, I'm the only girl. The rest are guys in this Guardians ministry. So this man, this stranger, turned to Becky and said, "So you were chosen, just like Mary." And she collapsed of her brain aneurysm there in the parking lot. Well, I was working on an edit for Jeffco Public Schools, and I got the call from the hospital saying, "Your wife has collapsed at church, can't tell you a whole lot more." And of course, this was very, very traumatic for me and for my family. And it wasn't until many hours into this situation that we heard the story about this stranger and what he had said to Becky before she collapsed of her aneurysm. And once we heard it, that he had told her she was chosen just like Mary, I don't know, Cheryl, the confusion, the darkness, the pain all lifted, because for us as Catholics to hear that, it was as if God had sort of taken the curtain between this world and the next and shown us a little bit of, what may have gone on there. And the fact that she was chosen meant everything to us. I was able to meet this man. He attended the funeral. His name was Oliver. He was a migrant from Nigeria, and he had come to this country and was having a lot of trouble adjusting to our culture and the language and everything else. And I really just embraced this man, and I thanked him for being with her at the end there. Becky was an organ donor, and her gifts helped 80 people worldwide.
Wow.
And through Donor Alliance, you are able to tell the Donor Alliance people if it's okay for you to contact the people that are recipients of the gift. And I said, of course. And out of those 80 people, only one responded. And this one man, his name was Paul, got the gift of life of a kidney from Becky. And it gave him a new lease on life. And when we found out his name was Paul, this was to us another sign. Paul was the name of Becky's little brother who had died of cancer when he was 4. The day we met, November 21st, 1970, on the Catholic calendar is the day of the presentation, when Mary was presented at temple by her parents. The day she had this conversation with Oliver, the day she had her collapse from her aneurysm, was May 31st, 2019, the day of the visitation, when Mary visits her cousin Elizabeth, and Jesus is in Mary's womb, and John the Baptist, who is in Elizabeth's womb, leaps for joy at the approach of the Savior. So I began to realize Mary was this through line in our life. Oliver, the stranger, was so affected by what happened that he pursued a life of religious study
Wow.
and was going to become a monk, went to a monastery in New Mexico. Ultimately, he decided it was not for him. But at every anniversary, I text him and I tell him how much we love him and how much he means to us.
Mhm.
Well, all of this, there's a philosopher named Thomas More who wrote a book called
Mhm.
Dark Night of the Soul. And in it, he says something beautiful. He says, when you have a dark night of the soul, which I definitely had, despite all of the religious implications, I mean, losing my beautiful Becky
Mhm.
after almost 49 years was a very, very hard thing. But he said, when you have these dark nights of the soul, sift them for gold. Find a way to find some good out of what happened, out of the darkness. And so this book was my way of sifting that whole thing for the gold. And so I honored Becky because she is actually in my book as a
Mhm.
character. The
Mhm.
book is based on real events, but I had to invent a few characters to, kind of compress timelines. And so she's one of those in my book.
Mhm.
And so I guess that really was the impetus for writing it, was Becky and what happened.
Mhm. Wow, what an incredible story. It still gives me chills. I mean, I know I've heard the story before, but you're moving forward with so much grace and so much, I don't know. I think to me, you have so much compassion and empathy and so much soul, and I think that the world needs a lot more of that. Oh, please, the world needs that.
Well, thank you for saying that. I have to tell you that I've sort of embarked on my own personal journey of deepening my faith. Last year, before the war uh, in Israel, in Gaza, I was privileged
Mm.
to go to the Holy Land on a pilgrimage with other people from Ave Maria who had not heard Becky's story. And it was at the Church of the Visitation where I
Mm.
was able to tell that story because I was just overwhelmed. I broke down being there, and telling her story there was very cathartic
Mhm.
for me. In just a few weeks, I'm going on another pilgrimage where there have been Marian apparitions to Lourdes and Fatima and Medjugorje. And it's just, again, part of my way to help me understand more about Mary and the role that she has played in my life. And I'm also now on the church's baptismal preparation team, and they ask me to tell Becky's story to people coming into the church.
Mhm.
And it has a very powerful impact on the people who hear it.
Mhm. That brings me to another question. Are you writing another book? Are you, to me, 'cause it just kind of segues into another book, not only sharing, Becky's story and Oliver and, all of the links to the church and to Jesus and everything, but your pilgrimage, to the Holy Land and then your pilgrimage, all of that, I think, I'm sure you're documenting it. My goodness, you're a journalist. It's still in your
I
blood.
Yes, I did a daily diary when I was in the Holy Land, and I plan to do another one on this other pilgrimage upcoming. And the answer to your question is yes.
Mhm.
Um, I kind of have resisted it a little bit because it's opening places in my heart that are hard for me. Every
Mhm.
time I tell her story, it takes a little bit away from me.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, but I think it's worth it. And
Mhm.
so, yes, that is my next project. So thank you for asking.
Mhm. What do you think Becky would say to you right now about not only the book Poppy, but I mean, I'm sure you still feel her around you
Oh,
all the
yes,
time.
all the time. She was good about keeping my big head in check. If I'd win an Emmy or, we had a big fancy broadcast thing going on and we got, dressed up in our finest to go to what celebration it may have been. She just always so grounded and so down to earth. And, she took the air out of my head balloon really, really quick. So I think that would be part of what she would say about Poppy. Oh, that's nice. What are we having for dinner? Um, and the thing I guess I miss most about her, Cheryl, is her laughter. I have a picture of her downstairs because when you work for a TV station, you get all of this great gear, that's branded, of course, 9 News and all that.
Mhm.
And I came home one evening to find her in one of my 9 News pullovers and a little cap like this. And she just was looking at me like, you think you're really something, huh? And I laugh every time I took a picture of her in all of that. And it's my favorite picture of her because she has that sort of look that is, it's full of humor and full of love.
Mhm.
And she's with me now as I
Mhm.
speak to you.
Mhm.
Before our conversation, I asked her to help guide me. I think she's my guardian angel.
Mhm.
I know she looked over me in the Holy Land, and now she's going to look over me on this next pilgrimage too, experiencing what I experience.
Mhm. And when is the pilgrimage?
It's coming up in October.
Okay. Wow. Well, I can't wait to hear about that.
Well, good. And here's the thing, I'm actually going with the priest who was there the day Becky had her incident at Ave Maria. He since
Wow.
has moved on to another church. But when I
Mhm.
found out that he was leading this pilgrimage, I just thought, how perfect.
Wow.
And his name is Father Gus, and I'm really looking forward to spending time with him.
Mhm. So I would like to hear a little bit more about your sons and
Mhm.
your daughter, right? You have 2 boys and a
Yep,
girl,
you
and
bet.
how they're doing because I mean that was pretty traumatic, for them, rocking the family and,
Yeah.
coming out of nowhere, such a shock.
Yes, but I think in each of our cases, hearing this story was such a beautiful way from God to
Mhm.
help with our healing.
Mhm.
I think about families that have sudden things that occur. There is
Mhm. Hey, you just froze. Uh-oh. Hmm.
from which we can draw strength.
Okay.
We did a
Um,
family. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I'm going to interrupt because you froze while you
Oh,
were describing that. So,
yes.
right at the very beginning of as you were telling the story about your family, that's when you froze.
Okay.
Can you pick it
We'll
up
try
from
it
there?
again. Sorry about that.
Okay. No, that's fine.
So, in terms of all of us collectively, we drew strength from the story we heard from Oliver, from
Mhm.
the circumstances surrounding, her aneurysm and her encounter at church. And we felt that in a way, God had gifted us with an answer. And a lot of
Mhm.
families that have sudden illness or
Mhm.
accidents and loved ones are taken away, I don't feel have this gift. And so I feel very blessed. The, uh, the weekend after Becky's funeral, we took a family hike and we went up to our favorite hiking spot up
Mhm.
above Georgetown, and it's called Three Creeks.
Mhm.
And there's some beautiful columbines that grow along the stream. And after the hike, we were driving back towards where we live here in Douglas County, and there was a rainstorm over by Chatfield Reservoir,
Mhm.
and a beautiful rainbow was
Mhm.
stretching from the reservoir across 470. And Cheryl, this has never happened to me in my life. We were in the car and we drove into the rainbow. The car filled with light, and we were streaming with tears. I could not believe what was happening. We were bathed in this multicolored light, and to us,
Wow.
it was yet another sign from God.
Mhm.
We coupled this with the news of Paul, in Missouri, who had gotten one of Becky's gifts of life, who was named after her little brother. And I'll tell you one other thing. This past November, the anniversary of when we met at that little dance,
Mhm.
we celebrated it more than our wedding
Mm.
anniversary. And so it's always a tough day for me, November 21st.
Mhm.
But I was sitting in our living room feeling down, thinking about her, looking at that picture I talked to you about.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, the room filled with the smell of roses. And I had my phone on the couch next to me, and it lit up with a notification from someone I used to work with at 9 News. I didn't know this guy was even Catholic because we didn't talk about our faith at work. And the notification said, and I quote, "Tonight is the night Mary is passing through your home."
Wow.
And it was apparently something that the Knights of Columbus had put out, perhaps connected to November 21st, the feast of the presentation of Mary.
Right.
And I just lost it. I just said, God, thank you again. He keeps sending me these things to tell me that, he knows it was hard, but I also know that she's with him in heaven. And I know that we have the best guardian angel that one could ask for. So that's really, I guess, the answer to how we are all dealing with this 5 years later. And she continues to loom large in our lives. Our faith looms large in our lives, and it always will.
Jack, I have never heard of anybody driving through a rainbow. I did not know that that was physically possible.
It happened.
That's incredible. Okay, so I'm going to switch gears just a little bit now, but thank you for sharing that story and honoring Becky, and we'll all kind of keep her in our hearts, especially on November 21st. I'm really good at remembering dates. I don't remember what I had for breakfast this morning, but I'm really good at remembering dates. So I will definitely keep her in my heart, and you and your family, every November 21st.
Thank you.
So who or what is Red Robin?
Well, let me tell you a bit about just the events that transpire in my book Poppy, a novel about a colorful Colorado life. All happened, and as I said, there's only a couple of characters that I had to invent for purposes of compressing timelines and whatnot. Red Robin is not one of those. He was a real person. He was an artist. He identified as a Zuni. I say identified because we found out later through research he was actually Hispanic, but he was raised in the Zuni culture.
Wow.
And he was a gifted sand painter and also a gifted watercolor artist. And the Douglas family up there in Evergreen encountered him on one of these many trips they made through the Southwest, contacting artists and, different people that made baskets and painting and weaving. And they just realized that this man, there was something about him that touched them deeply. And so they really made him a part of their family. And he almost became an uncle, almost a second father to my aunt. Her name was Eve. And so Red Robin would come up to this beautiful home in Evergreen and spend time with the children. And there's an episode in the book that is based on something that happened. He took Eve to the back of this beautiful lodge, and we had a little creek running back behind it. It's dry riverbed now, but Eve called it a crick, and she said Red Robin took her by the side of this creek, and he wanted to teach her a lesson. And so he gave her a stick, and he said, "I want you to churn up the bottom of this creek and see what happens." She's a little girl, so she does what she is asked to do. And he says, "What do you see?" And she had lifted up, these clouds of silt, and it became all cloudy. And she said, it's hard to see. I can't see the bottom anymore. All right, well, let's be patient. Let's just wait. And they waited and they waited. And eventually, he turned to her and said, "Well, what do you see now?" She said, "Well, it's all clear. The water's clear." And Red Robin told her, "Well, life is like that. You just have to be patient. When the clouds happen, they eventually will go away." And it's a lesson she never forgot and recounted it in oral history. So I incorporated it in the book. But he ended up working for Eric at the Denver Art Museum.
Wow.
And he was just this amazing sand painter who later did watercolors for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And he was also a World War II hero, Purple Heart recipient, amazing man. And so he is one of many real people that populate this book.
Okay, so now since you gave me that nice little segue, thank you for that, of World War II, that was another thing about your grandfather that I found was so compelling that he actually commanded or commandeered a hospital,
Commanded.
commanded a
Yep.
hospital in the Pacific, including 110 nurses. As a woman who worked in a hospital for, many, many years, 20 years plus, um, I really, really tip my hat to him because having to deal with 110 nurses, he must be quite the courageous man.
Well, I'll tell you, he was tapped because of his administrative skills at the Denver Art Museum.
Wow.
And so he was asked to help organize this hospital. It was in New Hebrides, and they were on the front lines of the Pacific War.
Hmm.
I actually have some documentation, thanks to the archivists at the Denver Art Museum and up at the Highland Homestead in Evergreen, where he got his orders to ship out with all of these nurses from Camp Carson, which is now Fort Carson. And it was a top secret mission. They didn't want anybody to know that they were doing this. So they took the train out to the West Coast, and then the West Coast, they boarded a transport ship, to the Pacific. And so, yes, he and these nurses had a wonderful relationship. Somehow his name Poppy got mangled into Pappy. So the nurses called him Pappy, and he called them, forgive me, think of the time frame, 1940s, his chicks, Pappy and his chicks, because he felt they needed a lot of managing.
Uh-huh.
And these women were heroic. I mean, they were seeing horrific injuries
Yeah.
from these soldiers that were coming back from the front lines, from fighting the Japanese, and a lot of hidden injuries too. Today we would call it PTSD.
Hmm.
Back then they called it shell shock.
Hmm.
And Eric, to his credit, experimented with music therapy as a way to deal with these traumatized soldiers. And he organized choirs because remember, his dad was this music liturgist.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so he would write home to Evergreen and said, can you send me some scores of, classical choral pieces that I can have these convalescing men perform in their choir?
Hmm.
And this choir, he said in diaries and letters, did more for their mental health than just about everything else. And so in a way, he pioneered music therapy.
Hmm.
Well, these nurses, after the war ended, Eric wrote them each one of them, a little verse so that they could remember their time together in the Pacific. And they continued to hold reunions for as long as
Wow.
Eric lived until 1956, every year when they got together. And Eric really didn't like the focus to be on him. So when he developed a very advanced form of bone cancer that ended up taking one of his arms, he always had these upbeat assessments. I was amazed at this correspondence between him and some of these nurses
Hmm.
that, oh, the prognosis is great. I'm going to be fine. I'm going to pull out of it. And of course, he didn't. But he
Hmm.
didn't want them to know. He didn't want the focus to be on him or his health. But yes, Pappy and his chicks, he had a great relationship and they loved him and he loved them back.
Well, actually, I was afraid you were going to say something worse. So the chicks, I think, that's pretty soft. That's no problem. So this was in the 1940s, correct?
When he was in wartime, yes.
So how old was he at that time, at that point?
He died at the age of 56, 58 in 1956. So back up 10 years. Yeah, he was in his 40s when he was commanding the hospital. And it was interesting because keep in mind, he still had this other responsibility at the Denver Art Museum for the Indian
Wow.
Arts Department. And he kept up the administrative duties long distance, 7,000 miles away through letter writing. Frida, my grandmother, helped him carry out, what he wanted done in the Indian Arts Department. And it kind of rankled the leadership at the Denver Art Museum. They kind of thought, oh, Eric's going to be off to war. We can do our own thing now. He really had ownership of this department and what he wanted done. And it did create a little bit of friction, actually.
Oh, I'll bet.
But when he returned from war, all was forgiven, and he continued with his art museum work up until the day he died.
So did you know him?
I knew him as a 2-year-old.
Okay.
And my memory of him was when he had this advanced bone cancer. They had taken the arm, and I just had a very hazy memory of him being this tall, one-armed giant. And so it really was through writing this book that I got to know him, by reading his journals and his diary and his letters. I really got to understand the kind of man he was and the innovator he was. If I can just briefly tell you about some of the things he did as a museologist. He would come up with ways to showcase the art. If you go into the Denver Art Museum today, and what's now known as the Native Arts Department, and you will see some of these beautiful items, like some seed pots or some Navajo blankets or some buckskin leggings. They're right out in the open. And that's because Eric did not want this stuff trapped under glass, is what he called it. He wanted to break it out of the cabinets and put it out there. He wanted to put it on pedestals. He wanted to use lighting to highlight the beauty of these pots and these different items. He wanted to paint the backgrounds to match where they came from. For example, if a pot that came from the Hopi at First Hano in Arizona, he wanted to make sure that the wall reflected that landscape. The yellows in the clay and the green of the sage. And these were ideas that he co-pioneered with another museum contemporary. His name was Rene de Harnecourt in New York's Museum of Modern Art. And they were kind of on parallel paths as museum innovators. And they wanted to bring Native artists into museums to showcase how they wove a blanket, how they made a pot. They also helped co-direct an exhibit in San Francisco in 1939.
Wow.
And one of the innovations there was a mural, a beautiful mural of a Cheyenne war party. And the mural had all of these men on horseback, but they kept the feathers on the chief who was leading the war party 3D, real. And they snaked a pipe of compressed air up so that the feathers rippled. So as you're looking at this mural, as you walk into this exhibit, it looks like he's riding in the wind. And think about that. It's 1939. Still innovative by today's standards.
That's amazing. That's incredible. Okay, so one thing I really would like to know is, what do you think Poppy would say to you about the book?
I would like to think that he is grateful that I have helped preserve not really his legacy and his life, but the legacies and lives of the Native creators. And if nothing else, the message that this is living art, that people who worried at one time that these Native peoples would disappear will outlive us all, and that their art is not only a thing of the past, but a thing of the present and a thing of the future.
Beautiful. Well, Jack, thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you so much for being here and spending your time with us.
Cheryl, it's been my honor. Thank you.
You are welcome. Do you have any final little pearls of wisdom or final things you'd like to leave with the audience before we sign off?
Just that if you've not had the opportunity to visit the Highwan Heritage Park up in Evergreen, please visit. My book is available up there.
Nice.
And also the Denver Art Museum has a special exhibit about Eric Douglas and his legacy. It's called Weaving a Foundation. It's primarily some of the textiles that he collected, and some of which have never been shown. And that is on view through January of next year. So
Oh, good.
two
Okay.
opportunities to learn more about him and his life.
Okay. Excellent. Well, and thank you for everything that you have done to, tell his story and to promote the Denver Art Museum and just to, keep the heritage and the spirit of the Native American alive. I think it's very
Thank you.
important.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. What a story. Please share this with everybody you know. There's a lot of wonderful little tidbits and life's lessons in some of the things that Jack has shared with us. And I think if we could all listen to each other's stories, share our stories, I really do believe the world would be a better place. And I am really hoping and praying for that mightily these days. And that is the way of the Femininja.